Many of the historical markers in Bullitt County describe events that occurred during the Civil War. In this presentation, we will briefly describe these events, along with related activities. Following the attack on Fort Sumter at Charleston, South Carolina in April 1861, folks in the border states frequently found themselves in opposition, some declaring for the South, others for the North. It was no different in Bullitt County, with men like Phil Lee organizing units for the South and others volunteering for local Union units. However, it was the middle of September before any war action touched the county. The Confederates had already seized the L&N lines and equipment in Tennessee, and on September 18th, Confederate General Buckner ordered that the lines in Kentucky up to Lebanon Junction also be seized. A group of local secessionists promptly took charge of a locomotive at Lebanon Junction. After they rode it across the Rolling Fork Bridge, they set the bridge afire, destroying it. Brigadier General Robert Anderson, of Fort Sumter fame and a native of Louisville, had been assigned as commander of the Department of Kentucky in May. When news of the bridge burning reached him, Anderson assigned Brigadier General W. T. Sherman to lead a force southward to defend Lebanon Junction and points southward along the railroad to Elizabethtown. However, Sherman was, at that time, a general without an army. All that was available to him was General Lovell Rousseau's Louisville Legion, then camped across the Ohio River in Indiana, and a small number of home guards in Louisville. These were quickly gathered, and by midnight were aboard trains heading for Lebanon Junction. Among the home guards was a unit under the command of then Captain John Marshall Harlan, shown here. This company constituted the guard at General Sherman's headquarters, which was established in the hotel at Lebanon Junction, shown in a drawing here. Finding the wooden bridge burned, Sherman had the majority of his forces ford the stream and moved on to Muldraw's Hill, leaving Brigadier General Richard W. Johnson in charge at Lebanon Junction, with only Captain Harlan's company in place. And that brings us to an interesting story. It seems that Sherman sent a message back indicating that he expected a fight and ordered Johnson to send him 5,000 rounds of ammunition. Captain Harlan, the future Supreme Court Justice, was given the task of solving the problem of getting that ammunition across the river with the bridge down. And according to Johnson's memoirs, Harlan went back that night some 2 miles along the railroad and aroused a farmer and told him to hitch up his wagon and prepare for a movement into the enemy's country. The farmer demurred, but, seeing that resistance was useless, he got up and harnessed his team. Then he was required to drive to the junction, where there was a handcar. This handcar was placed on top and across the wagon body, and around it were placed the boxes of ammunition. About this time it was broad daylight, and Harlan started with the team for the crossing of the Rolling Fork. The stream was belly deep to the horses, but was safely crossed. In order to direct the team, Harlan mounted the leader without a saddle. On reaching the south bank, the handcar was placed on the railroad track, the ammunition loaded on it, and then pushed to the top of the hill and down grade to Sherman's headquarters. We will hear from Captain Harlan again later. According to Kincaid Herr, author of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, 1850 to 1963. The lines of the L&N south of Elizabethtown, Kentucky, remained in the hands of the Confederates until shortly after the beginning of the year 1862. At that time, General Don Carlos Buell, utilizing the lines of the Louisville and Nashville to the fullest, began an advance into Dixie with a huge force, which had Nashville, Tennessee as its ultimate objective. On February 15, 1862, the Boys in Blue entered Bowling Green, Kentucky, and less than 2 weeks later, they were in the capital city of Tennessee. However, the railroad lines would continue to be a preoccupation of both sides, as we will see. This historical marker is located in Lebanon Junction in front of the fire department on Main Street. It reads, USA General William T. Sherman, with 4,000 troops, made headquarters here, late September 1861. Object, to secure Muldrow's Hill against anticipated onslaught of Confederates toward Louisville and to rally Kentuckians to Union cause. CSA General Simon B. Buckner took Bowling Green, establishing Confederate line across Kentucky, but failed to push north. No major action occurred. The war returned to Kentucky during the late summer of 1862 that included attacks on the railroad bridge at Shepherdsville in September. David Strange wrote about these attacks, and here he is to share it with you.
In Bullitt County, as in most of Kentucky during the war, guerrilla bands wreaked havoc, burning bridges and raiding towns and generally causing trouble, but having little real military effect. But the year 1862 was different. During that time, Confederate General Braxton Bragg sent thousands of troops into Kentucky from Tennessee, hoping for a general uprising of the citizens and the gain of Kentucky to the Confederate cause. Confederate cavalry swept up through Mumfordville, Frankfort, Lexington, and Bardstown. Union troops withdrew to strongholds in Louisville and Elizabethtown. On September 6, cavalry officer and famous guerrilla John Hunt Morgan sent a small force to Shepherdsville to capture the stockade there and burn the L&N Railroad Bridge over the Salt River. Morgan sent Captain John B. Hutchison, commander of Company E, in the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment, along with 4 companies of the 2nd Kentucky and 2 howitzers, to perform the mission. Destroying the bridge would deny federal forces a quick path for reinforcements to Lebanon Junction and deny the forces in LJ a quick path of retreat to Louisville. At daylight on September 7, Captain Hutchison arrived at the federal stockade at Shepherdsville. The stockade was on the south bank of the Salt River near the railroad bridge. There was no road bridge built in Shepherdsville until 1906, and the town was on the north side of the river as it is today. About 85 men of the 54th Indiana Infantry Regiment manned the small fort. Hutchison positioned his artillery and then sent a flag of truce demanding the surrender of the fort. The federal commander, Captain John Tinker, rejected the demand, but quickly changed his mind when the Confederates fired a volley from their howitzers. The Federals suffered 1 man wounded in that encounter. The Federals were paroled and the Confederates set to work on destroying the bridge. But destruction of the bridge proved more difficult and time-consuming than expected. The new iron bridge, unlike the usual wooden bridges of the time, was resistant to the usual method of burning. Learning that Federal troops were coming down the rail from Louisville to stop him, Hutchison had to quickly leave Shepherdsville before being attacked and before completing his mission. Newspapers reported the bridge only slightly damaged. This was the first of what would be 3 limited success attempts to destroy the bridge at Shepherdsville that year. But the news of Hutchison's action on Shepherdsville, so close to Louisville, sent shockwaves through the Federal High Command in Louisville. With attacks now coming from Shepherdsville, Mount Washington, and Shelbyville, an attack on Louisville seemed imminent. Trenches were dug to defend the big city, and evacuations of civilians to Indiana were begun. Reinforcements were sent to Shepherdsville. Federal forces were withdrawn from Lebanon and based in Lebanon Junction to help defend the railroad there. The Confederate Army had problems of its own, though. The general uprising of citizens was not going as well as hoped. The Confederate ranks were thinly spread out over a large area. In this campaign, there were generally not huge armies massed against each other, as in the Virginia campaigns, where thousands died in a day. In Kentucky, as author Kenneth Hoffendorfer wrote, they died by 2s and 10s. Bragg commanded 26,000 men, but they were scattered all over areas of the state. Rather than large battles, small fights, or skirmishes were often all that could be mustered. It was often a game of cat and mouse, with units from both sides trying to find and attack the other at a weak point, and each not knowing the other's true strength. Skirmishes of 10 to 100 men broke out all around the county and around the state. On September 21, a Confederate force made a second attempt at the railroad bridge in Shepherdsville, but had the bad luck of attacking just as some 1,500 Federal troops under General R.S. Granger were stopping in the town, creating a much more powerful than normal defense force. The Confederate raid was repulsed, killing 5 and capturing 28, with no loss on the Federal side. On September 28th, Baxter Smith and his 4th Tennessee tried again, and this time took Shepherdsville, with orders to remain until the railroad bridge over the Salt River was destroyed. He advanced through Shepherdsville to near Okolona, but held back at that point to complete his main mission. Confederate Union units also advanced through Mount Washington from High Grove and occupied Fern Creek. Another Confederate force advanced along the Shelbyville Road past Middletown, just a few miles from downtown Louisville. But the Federal forces in Louisville, now numbering some 50,000 strong, began to realize its numerical superiority and began to fight back with more confidence. At Shepherdsville, Baxter Smith had again bogged down because of difficulty destroying the Iron Railroad Bridge, sending hurried dispatches back to headquarters asking for powder and drills to carry out the job. A Federal force from Louisville skirmished with Smith's advance guards north of Shepherdsville. 1 Federal soldier and 4 Confederates died. Federal cavalry began moving from Elizabethtown against the Confederate rear. Thousands of Federal cavalry and infantry began advancing from Louisville down Shepherdsville Road, Bardstown Road, and Shelbyville Road. Several fights erupted in Fern Creek and continued as Confederates withdrew south through Mount Washington. Imagine hundreds of cavalry soldiers riding down the main street of Mount Washington. First, the wounded and retreating Confederates so recently flushed with victory, and then the Federal troops on the hunt and gaining confidence with each attack. Cannon fire coming from both sides, hitting 2 houses and taking tops off of trees as each would pause and regroup. Baxter Smith was forced to retreat from Shepherdsville by way of Cedar Grove Road, with the bridge still only partially destroyed. Though a Confederate general, and thus many historic books and even a roadside history marker in the county, reported the bridge destroyed, it was not. It seems that both the captain and his general decided to expand on the truth about completion of orders so the soldiers could get out of town and avoid capture. The bridge would be repaired in only a few days. 3 attempts without success. Federal troops followed close behind the retreating Confederates, stopping at Cedar Grove Church to rest and decide which direction to go. continue on Cedar Grove Road east, or follow Deatsville Road south. After exploring both directions, a local boy told them that a few Confederate cavalrymen had been watching them from Deatsville Road. Some of the Federal soldiers were sent cross-country along Green's Branch to surround them. 2 Confederate captains were captured, along with a lieutenant and 19 privates. Numerous such skirmishes occurred for several days all along the roads of Bullitt County, as Federal troops pushed their enemies south to Bardstown and beyond, eventually meeting in force at Perryville on October 8th, the biggest battle of the Civil War in Kentucky. The Confederate armies withdrew back to Tennessee after that, and no such serious military campaign was ever brought to Kentucky again, though the terrible guerrilla wars had only just begun.
Returning briefly to the Cedar Grove incident, Colonel Menon Milliken of the 1st Ohio Cavalry filed this report on the brief conflict.
Agreeable to instructions received from the general commanding the division, I crossed the river this morning and proceeded on the road to Bardstown until I came to Cedar Church 5 miles from this point. A body of the enemy had encamped there last evening. I here turned to the right, proceeded a mile, and returned, and took the road to Woodbridge, proceeding on it 2.5 miles, and returned. When I had proceeded a mile, a lad met me who lived on the Bardstown road, who told me a squad of cavalry had followed us back toward the church. I immediately sent a company across the country to intercept their return, and pushed on to the church. I had been there but a moment, and was endeavoring to find which road they had gone on when my intercepting party opened fire. I hurried to them, and found them driving the enemy toward us. I formed one company in the road, and letting down the fence, placed a company on their left flank. When they came up, resistance was impossible. They threw down their arms and surrendered.
Colonel Milliken later lost his life in combat at the Battle of Stone River in Tennessee. The next Confederate incursion to reach Bullitt County was part of Morgan's Christmas raid in December, and that takes us to the next historical marker located in Lebanon Junction on Main Street beside the fire department. Morgan's raiders hit Glasgow on Christmas Eve and pushed northward, reaching Elizabethtown 4 days later. North of that town, he destroyed 2 wooden trestles at Muldraw's Hill. One of his next goals was to fire the Rolling Fork trestle, but he was foiled this time. John Harlan, whom we mentioned earlier, was now Colonel Harlan, heading a Union regiment stationed in Gallatin, Tennessee. He was ordered to pursue Morgan's forces and stop them from destroying the tracks and trestles if possible. This included the reconstructed bridge over the Rolling Fork River at Lebanon Junction. After leaving the train at Munfordville, Harlan moved his forces to Elizabethtown, where he learned that Morgan was encamped on the Rolling Fork, where the Elizabethtown and Bardstown Road crosses that stream. Sending his cavalry in advance, Harlan marched his infantry in that direction. Reaching the ridge above Morgan's encampment, the Union forces engaged the enemy with cannon and rifle fire, which was returned. 2 of Morgan's regiments and a portion of his artillery had marched toward Lebanon Junction to destroy the bridge there. Upon hearing the sounds of rifle and artillery fire, they abandoned their task and returned to assist their brothers in arms. After the rebels broke off the engagement, Harlan moved his troops to defend the bridge at Lebanon Junction. Morgan's forces made their way back to Tennessee, but would return 6 months later. By this time, the Union Army had constructed 6 stockades between Elizabethtown and Shepherdsville. The plat drawings of Big Run Trestle and Sulphur Fork Trestle, both on Muldraugh Hill, are shown here. The others were located at Lebanon Junction, Belmont, Bardstown Junction, and Shepherdsville. The stockades were manned only with infantry and proved woefully inadequate against troops with artillery. In March 1863, the Union Army proposed upgrading the stockade in Shepherdsville by erecting an artillery and infantry parapet, together with a line of rifle pits connecting it with entanglements and the establishment of artillery. According to official reports, the completed fort was armed with 3 12-pounder light artillery pieces. The stockade would be named Fort DeWolf for Lieutenant William DeWolf of the 3rd U.S. Artillery, who was killed at Williamsburg, Virginia. This marker is located next to Highway 61, just south of the Salt River Bridge. This drawing, made by a Union engineer, shows the layout of Fort DeWolf. The solid lines show how the fort appeared at the time of the engineer's inspection. The dotted lines are proposed improvements. Later drawings found at the National Archives indicate that most of the improvements were made. It was constructed so that the L&N literally passed through it. Between the fort and the river was a barracks, and along the railroad a brick water tank. Constructed between the river and the fort was a line of inclined palisades, a wooden wall 5 feet high made of sharpened posts. The line of palisades was designed to protect the barracks and to keep an attack from flanking the fort. The fort was only partially finished in July 1863 when Morgan attacked and burned the stockade at Bardstown Junction. Morgan's final raid began in Tennessee on June 11th and ended with his capture in Ohio on July 16th. It coincided with the Vicksburg Campaign and the Gettysburg Campaign, and it was meant to draw U.S. troops away from these fronts by frightening the North into demanding their troops return home. In this respect, it was a failure. Major Israel Stiles of the 63rd Indiana Infantry, the commander of the stockade at Shepherdsville, received information that Morgan was at the Shepherdsville Road. He assumed that the railroad bridge at Shepherdsville would be attacked. In preparation for a defensive stand, he ordered Captain Morris to gather his men from the Bardstown Junction and Belmont and bring them to Shepherdsville. This marker is located at the intersection of Highway 61 and the Belmont Road. Lieutenant W. F. Henderson was in command of the detachment of the 63rd Indiana manning the stockade at Belmont. Henderson probably had about 30 men under his command. As Morgan approached, Henderson received word from his commander to abandon the stockade at Belmont. Henderson and his men climbed aboard the northbound train and rattled toward Shepherdsville and safety, 6 miles north. Unfortunately for them, they reached Bardstown Junction just 3.5 miles north of Belmont to find that Morgan and his 2,500 troopers had already arrived. No matter how brave the little band of Union soldiers might have been, it was pointless to resist. The marker is located at the intersection of Highway 61 and Chappies Lane. The advance element of Morgan's command arrived at Bardstown Junction just as Captain Morris was leaving for Shepherdsville. The Confederates chased the Union soldiers, capturing 2 of them, but the rest made good their escape. The other half of Morris's company was not so lucky. The Confederates burned the little trestle over Long Lick Creek and the water tank house and stockade at Bardstown Junction before capturing the train, which included Henderson and his small command. Those soldiers were paroled and robbed along with the other passengers and the contents of the train safe before the train was sent back to Elizabethtown. The Union forces at Shepherdsville braced for an attack that never came. Which brings us to our next marker, which is located next to the Fort de Wolf marker. It reads, July 2nd, 1863. CSA General J.H. Morgan began raid to prevent USA move to Tennessee and Virginia. Repulsed at Green River, July 4th. Defeated a USA force at Lebanon, July 5th. Moved through Bardstown, July 6th. After night march, crossed here, July 7th. Rested troop few hours and proceeded to Brandenburg. Crossed to Indiana, July 8th. He continued raid until captured in northeast Ohio, July 26th. Which brings us almost to the end of our presentation. However, we have one additional marker that may relate to the Civil War. It is located off of Highway 245, about 50 to 100 yards away from the Roses Distillery. The marker is on the right, the distillery is on the left. The marker is on a hill and hidden by trees. Once you get to the sign, just to the right of it is a concrete sidewalk that leads to the cemetery. This graveyard was discovered in the 1970s when new construction was planned on the highway. As it was in the new road's pathway, steps were taken to move it to a nearby location on Bernheim Forest property. Attempts were made to determine who was buried there, with varying degrees of success. As various claims have been made, including railroad workers who died of cholera, a possible slave cemetery, and also the final resting place of Union soldiers stationed nearby who died of cholera, we choose to include it with this presentation. While we've discussed the various incidents that occurred in Bullitt County, we would be remiss if we failed to remember those members of the military with Bullitt County roots who lost their lives during the Civil War. A new memorial plaque was dedicated on the courthouse lawn on Memorial Day 2020. It contains the names of all such men who lost their lives during any conflict, including 45 names of those lost during the Civil War. We close this presentation as David Strange reads the names of these fallen warriors.
Henry Ashe, Ben Barnett, David L. Brooks, Joseph Buckman, Alexander Burton. Edward C. Caldwell, Thomas Clark, Ben Cole, Henry Crone, James Easton. John Jefferson Garrett, Charles Hardesty, Christian Harshfield, James A. Hill, Jr., Joseph Hoagland. Richard Hoagland, John Holsclaw, John Jackson, Sr., Daniel Jenkins, Aaron L. Kaufman, Charles S. Macy, James Masden, Jesse McWilliams, John P. Mix, Lorenzo Murphy, Theodore Pearl, John T. Reardon, W. D. Raymond, John William Rogers, John Shoptaw, William Shoptaw, F. B. Smith, John Smith, Alan A. Snellen, Joe Southern, Richard Southern, Darwin Stoner, James Stoner, William Stoner, James Sweeney. William H. Toomey, Caleb Welch, Samuel Burks Williams, Thomas Withers, William Younger.
This has been a presentation of the Bullitt County History Museum. Thank you for joining us.